Good evening, welcome back. Today we are going to be summarizing Module 7 for Course 3 Real Estate Salesperson Program, delivered by Humber. So let's not waste any time and let's get back into summarization. Okay, so lesson 1, they talk about fundamentals of leasing residential real properties. And here they talk about defining common terms used in leasing. So key terms include the following: landlord or lessor, tenant or leasee, leasehold interest, term, fixed terms, and periodic tenancy, tenancy agreement, standard form or lease/residential tenancy agreement, rental unit, rent, lawful rent, rent increases guideline, rent deposit, use restriction. The difference between a lease and an agreement to lease: a lease is a contract for the use and occupation of a property for a specified time and consideration. An agreement to lease is an agreement that sets out details in anticipation of writing a formal lease agreement or agreement by both parties to accept the terms, conditions, and clauses as outlined in the agreement to lease. A contract does not exist until a lease is in place. Residential leases must include the use of a standard form of lease, whether or not any other lease form is used. Lesson 1 was pretty straightforward. Moving on to Lesson 2, key components of leasing. So, the 4 types of residential tenancies. The 4 types of tenancy are fixed term tenancy, 2 periodic tenancy, 3 tenancy at will, and 4 tenancy at sufferance. Each arise from a specific action or inactions of the landlord, tenant, or both. The standard form of lease. Most written residential lease arrangements must be made by using the standard lease form known as the residential tenancy agreement. The purpose of the standard lease is to help avoid misunderstandings, provide clarification of terms, and reduce the need of dispute resolution. For dispute resolution, all terms are mandatory. Any additional items must comply with the Residential Tenancy Act and Ontario Human Rights Code. Exemption from the tenant's standard form of lease. The following rental units are exempt from having to use the standard form of lease: care homes such as retirement homes, mobile home parks, and land lease communities. Social and supportive housing exempt from the rules from the rent rules under the Residential Tenancy Act. The mandatory terms for the standard lease. All the mandatory terms in the lease that must be completed for the lease to be valid is the parties to the agreement, a rental unit, contact information, term of the tenancy agreement, rent, services and utilities, rent deposit, and key deposit. Other terms of the standard lease. The following are examples of optional terms in the lease: smoking, tenant's insurance, changes to the rental unit, maintenance and repairs, assignment and subletting, and changes to the agreement. Landlord rights and responsibilities and prohibited landlord actions. Landlord have the right to collect a rent deposit, collect regular rent, and increase the rent only once a year by a maximum percentage set by the Ontario government. Landlords must keep the property in good repair, meeting all legal requirements, and provide the tenant with a copy of the written tenancy agreement. Under the Residential Tenancy Act, landlords cannot shut off a vital service, take the tenant's personal property, lock a tenant out of their rental unit, and insist on rent payment by post-dated checks or automatic debit. Insist on rent payment by post-dated check or automatic debit. Tenants' rights and responsibilities and prohibited tenant actions. Tenants have the right to security of tenancy and privacy. Tenants must pay rent, keep the rental unit clean, and repair any damage to the rental property. Tenants cannot change the locks without landlord permission or without rent, nor withhold rent for any reason. Dwelling units. A dwelling unit in a house unit that has one or more habitable rooms as self-contained living quarters, usually consisting of sanitary facilities, sleeping accommodations, and a kitchen. Buildings can be single-family, such as a detached home, or multi-units dwelling as the following: duplex, triplex, and fourplex, low-rise or garden apartments, and mid-rise or high-rise apartment buildings. Condos consist of individual units that are individually owned and common elements that are commonly owned by all unit owners. Wow, let me say that again. I don't know why sorry. Condos consist of individual units that are individually owned and common elements that are commonly owned by all unit owners. Okay. Moving on to lesson 3. Okay. Key considerations when leasing. Accessory dwelling units. In a two-dwelling, the primary dwelling unit is the main dwelling of the property, as accessory dwelling unit is a self-contained residential unit with a private kitchen, bathroom facility, and sleeping areas within the dwelling. Accessory dwellings can be on any floor of a house, including the basement. In addition to the house, and a secondary structure of the property, depending on the location and the structure of the accessory dwelling, privacy may be a concern to some potential tenants. Legal compliance of accessory dwelling units. Rental units must comply with all regulations. Example: zoning bylaws, the Ontario Building Code, the Ontario Fire Code, and the Electrical Safety Code. Significant fines may apply for failing to comply with the fire safety standards. You must be cautious when property houses an accessory dwelling unit. Ensuring the unit meets all current requirements is crucial. Property specific whoa, excuse me. Sorry about that. Okay. Property specific considerations. You will be able to help significantly by providing additional information about the unit and occupancy of any neighboring unit. For example, the number of the occupants of the other units, whether the other occupants have pets, additional costs and restrictions of shared facilities such as laundry or internet, availability of tenant and guest parking. Municipal bylaws and rental units. Municipal bylaws control the availability and condition of rental units. These bylaws vary considerably among municipalities. To provide appropriate advice, you must know your local bylaws. Some municipalities restrict the maximum number of occupants in a unit. Typically, this is based on the size of the unit. Often they dictate the minimum acceptance size for a bathroom. The landlord must ensure the rental property meets maintenance standards. If these standards are not set out in municipal bylaws, provincial maintenance standards apply. Some municipalities require rental housing licenses. To be licensed, a property must meet all safety and zoning standards. Zoning bylaws determine the type of buildings that are permitted in a specific area and how they may be used. Moving on to lesson 4. Key components of legislation affecting a residential lease. So the Residential Tenancy Act and Ontario Human Rights Code. The Residential Tenancy Act and Ontario Human Rights Code are two significant pieces of legislation that affect the residential rental markets. Together, they detail the rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants to ensure a system where rental units are clean, safe, and free of bias. It also ensures a system where landlords and tenants have a way to resolve dispute. Residential Tenancy Act provisions. The Residential Tenancy Act covers numerous provisions concerning: 1. Rent, allowable rent increases, deposits, and payments. Pet provisions, landlord entry allowances, rules for a landlord terminating a tenancy, including when the unit is required for personal use, allowable reasons and notification periods for a landlord to terminate a tenancy, rules and require notifications for a tenant terminating a tenancy. Assignment and subletting. Tenants may assign or sublet their unit with permission of the landlord. Landlord cannot unreasonably refuse such requests. An assignment transfers the tenant's lease to other person permanently. A sublet allows another person to occupy the unit temporarily and comply with the terms of the lease. Landlord and Tenant Board. Activities of the landlord and tenant board include determining matters raised in applications made by parties, making findings, making and issuing orders, mediating situations, adjudicating, for example, holding hearings, and hearing process is quite formalized, allowing both the landlord and tenant to make submissions and, where required, invite witnesses. Moving on to lesson 5, safety and compliance considerations. Landlord responsibilities for tenant safety. Landlord responsibility for tenant safety. Tenant safety is a landlord's most important responsibility. Ensuring a unit meets all safety standards helps to avoid safety issues and minimize liability. The building should be well lit at night, particularly entrances. The perimeter of the building should be obstruct free to prevent unauthorized access through upper floors and avoid hiding places. All windows and doors and access points should be adequate. Should have adequate security to prevent unauthorized access to the building or unit. Updating lock systems when a new tenant moves in paramount. Landlords must ensure smoke and carbon monoxide alarms are installed where required, and tenants are tested regularly. Tenants must not interfere with alarms, including removing the batteries. The electrical system must be provided to all habitable spaces and must be safe. Hazardous materials must be used, stored, and disposed of safely. Landlords are responsible for monitoring any illegal activity taking place within the building or on the property. Tenant obligations. Sometimes tenants are responsible for maintenance around the unit, such as snow removal. If they agree, under some circumstances, they may be restricted from activities that are otherwise allowable. Salesperson role, you can provide valuable information. Observing the code of ethics and keeping your knowledge up to date will ensure you provide the accurate information to both landlords and tenants. Okay. Okay. Lesson 6. They talk about compliance and due diligence of a salesperson. So, full disclosure, the general rule is to disclose everything. Some disclosures are expressly stated in the Code of Ethics. You must disclose any interest you have in a property, either directly or through a related party. Any material facts about the property or rental unit, as they may affect someone's purchase or rental decision. To avoid compliance issues, disclose early, disclose accurately, and disclose fully. Documentation's requirements. REBA requires you to use the most accurate tenancy agreement to approve. The approved wording aids full disclosure and help avoid potential compliance issues. You must document a relationship with the landlord or tenant as soon as possible, stating the scope of your service, the effective date and end date of the agreement. You must ensure that all document complies with the Residential Tenancy Act and the Ontario Human Rights Code. This includes advertising material, rental applications, additional clauses to the standard lease. When advertising a unit or completing paperwork, you must comply with all sections of the Ontario Human Rights Code to avoid perceived or real acts of discrimination. Competence. To provide competent service, you must know the residential leasing legislation. Knowing what is allowed and what is not ensures that you can offer accurate opinion. When the scope of an issue is beyond your expertise, you must refer the person to a third-party professional who is more qualified. When a landlord is adding or modifying a unit, you should ensure they use appropriately licensed and insured tradespeople, have appropriate permits, and are undergoing the required inspections. Moving on to lesson 7, responsibilities of parties involved. So, services a salesperson could provide a tenant. After listening to the tenant's criteria for both unit and location, you will identify rental units that closely match those criteria. You will be able to talk about features of the unit, neighborhood, and the surrounding area. Guide the tenant on factors that may affect their ability to lease, such as credit check and ability to pay the rental deposit. once you have verified the market price for the rent, you will create an agreement to lease. Then you will negotiate the agreement to lease with the landlord and explain the residential agreement, tenancy agreement to the tenant. Services a salesperson could provide to a landlord. Working for the landlord, you will research pricing of comparable rental units in the area and write an advertisement for the unit that complies with all legislation. You will determine where to place the advertisement, both online and traditional media. You will determine where to place the advertisement. You will write in any additional terms to add to the lease. Explain them both to the parties. The terms must not be prohibited by the Residential Tenancy Act. Qualifying people with as good rent tenants is far more effective than having to evict bad tenants. Landlords will appreciate the value you will add when helping to qualify and investigate prospective tenants. You will likely receive the agreement to lease on behalf of the landlord. To do so, you must be readily available and be able to explain and negotiate its terms. When working with the landlord, takes on the role of a property manager. Property manager perform a host of roles. These are defined in the agreement with the landlord. The role may include any or all of the following. For example, oversees maintenance and repairs, oversee contractors, and monitor vacant properties, be the main point of contact for tenants, provide any required notices to a tenant when requested by the landlord, collect rent, facilitate move-ins and move-outs and evictions, assess prospective tenants, and interact with other salespersons. The responsibility of a landlord. Landlords are responsible for ensuring the rental unit and building comply with the legislation and regulation. When constructing a new building or adding a rental unit to the existing structure or renovating a rental unit, they must follow the building code, Ontario code, and the local municipal bylaws. Smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and fire suppression equipment must be placed correctly, working, and tested regularly. The electrical system must comply with the electrical safety code and ensure the appropriate inspections are completed when required. Tenants have accessible and adequate means of egress and according to the building code. Leading practices to qualify tenants. When qualifying prospective tenants, these are the leading practices to avoid potential problems. Require that all tenants fully complete a rental application, complete a credit check even when an applicant appears creditworthy, follow up on all references provided by the tenant. When a tenant asks to pay the rent or rental deposit in installments, recognize the risk. Ideally, would require these to be paid in full before occupancy. When a tenant has moved quite often or is requiring immediate occupancy of a unit, recognize this is a signal to independently verify the reasons the tenant provides. This allows the landlord to make an informed decisions. And then moving on to lesson 8, rent roll. What is rent roll? Rent roll provides information on rents and rent payments for all the properties the landlord owns. If it can be used to assess the stability of payments and value of the property. Tenant ledger. A tenant ledger A tenant ledger provides a financial snapshot of rents, payments, and expenses for a specific tenant. It can be used to track cash flow and budget for expenses. In an eviction situation, it can provide an accurate picture of the tenant's payment record. Okay, moving on to lesson 9. Estimating the value of the rental property. The direct comparison approach to determine market rent. The direct comparison approach to determine market rent is commonly used in Ontario. It consists of comparing the unit with similar units to rent. To ensure the units are comparable, they should be located within the local market area, available for rent at or near the date of appraisal, appealing to the same type of tenant who would consider renting the subject property being appraised through an arm's length transaction. I have no idea what this last thing means. Through an arm's length transaction. What does that even mean? I have no idea. Anyways, moving on. Effective location, amenities, property condition, and layout of rental value. Generally, rent increases when the rental unit is in a good neighborhood, is close to desired amenities, has a good on-site amenities, and is in a good condition, has a desirable practical layout. And then confirm legal rent and expenses. Knowing accurate numbers for total rental income and total expenses can help a landlord make an informed decision about the property. And then lesson 10 is special leasing considerations. Landlords must realize the market is smaller for furnished rentals. The attraction of the unit and rent garnered will depend in part upon the quality of furnishings. While a furnished unit may command a higher rent, expenses may also increase due to furniture replacement costs, ongoing cleaning, and laundry expenses. Landlords should keep a fund to cover these replacements. Considerations for tenants leasing a furnished unit. Tenants seek furnished units for a host of reasons. They need to know the extent and condition of the furnishings. While moving is considerably easier compared to an unfurnished unit, rents are typically higher. Cost comparisons with unfurnished units may be a factor for some tenants. And then a short-term rental consideration. Leases for short-term rentals are typically 1 to 6 months. Short-term rentals are not subject to rent control, allowing the landlord to increase the rent according to the market conditions. Offsetting this to some degree are increased costs. Tenants may find furnishings and amenities to be more basic than they are used to. And then lastly, salesperson due diligence. You must perform the same due diligence for furnished and short-term rentals as for unfurnished units. As always, they must comply with all relevant code of ethics requirements. They must advertise units with all material facts and be aware of all additional information and considerations for such units. Alright, moving on to lesson 11. It is summary practice activities, which you can do by yourself. And then last module summary. Let's see if we have any good information here. Yeah, we already talked about everything here. Oh, this is a good summary actually. Okay. Anyways, this was a summary of module 7. Hope this helped. Yeah. And that's it for tonight. Well, I will see you back for module 8. Until then, stay safe and have a good night.